Hey, AP Comparative kids, let's talk about the argumentative essay. Today I've taken one of the sample questions from the College Board here, and I'm planning to answer the argumentative essay. So I want to give you an idea of how to write a claim properly and how to connect that claim to your body paragraphs. So the sample question that the College Board has posted is develop an argument as to whether democratic or authoritarian regimes are better at maintaining sovereignty in a country. Now, they've given you some guidance here of things you have to include. Choose one or more of the following four countries. So they're giving you some guidance on which countries to focus in on. And use the following course concept in your response: legitimacy. So you at least have to use legitimacy as one of your main points, one of your concepts you have to explain throughout. Now remember, this is only for the 2020 argumentative essay. In future years, they'll probably give you more concepts to choose from. You'll have more time allotted to you, and they won't give you suggestions of which countries to utilize. But of course, this is a little bit more shortened year. You also don't have the refutation point at the end. So let's take a glance at how you'd potentially answer this. Now, at first glance, when I look at this, I always think that sovereignty is a really tough concept for students to understand. It's really about your ability to control your land and control your government, your ability to hold power as a regime. And they've given you democratic and authoritarian regimes, and both of those options, can be difficult. I'd probably say that the democratic pathway is more difficult than the authoritarian pathway, because you could probably argue that Iran and Russia and China do a pretty good job of controlling their territory, but I decided to take the more democratic path in my response. So here I've already written up a claim for you. The first thing I did is I took part of the prompt. Democratic regimes are better at maintaining sovereignty. So I chose the democratic pathway. If you wanted to make this an authoritarian one, you just replace that with authoritarian. So the first thing you do in a claim is you take part of the question, part of the prompt, and you structure it for what pathway you're going to take. Democratic or authoritarian, you can argue either direction. The College Board is always going to give you an essay that you can choose your path, choose your own adventure. So here we go. Democratic regimes are better at maintaining sovereignty. Now, some people think that this would be a good enough claim. This is not for the College Board. You need to have a more detailed claim. You need to have lines of reasoning. So my lines of reasoning after this always include a because. And I think I always capitalize it as well because I want to make sure that the person that's reading this, the actual teacher that's reading this in June, that they see that I'm using lines of reasoning, that I'm going beyond just restating the prompt. So democratic regimes are better at maintaining sovereignty because power derives directly from the citizens, and they are more likely to face situations of change via compromise rather than violence. I'm going to put compromise and like peaceful protest. Now, this is kind of a lengthy response as far as a claim. You could write one, that might be a little shorter and more straight to the point, and that would be perfectly fine. Like let's make up one for authoritarian. Authoritarian regimes are better at maintaining sovereignty because they have more control and opposition is not as visible. So this is a lot shorter. It is more straight to the point. You do have to have two major pieces of evidence that you're focusing in on in your essay. So don't be afraid to have two separate points in your claim. That is perfectly fine and acceptable. So authoritarian regimes are better at maintaining sovereignty because they have more control, and opposition is not as visible. Thought about doing transparency, but we'll stick with this. So that's what you have to have. And what I always say is it's pretty easy to do your body paragraphs then. You take whatever you had first here, and this is the theme of paragraph 1. And whatever you have here is the theme of paragraph 2. So when I'd leave a space, always make sure you put a space after your claim. You want to make sure your claim is very well seen by the reader. So claim, space, then you get in your first body paragraph on your first topic and your second body paragraph on your second topic. Now it's going to be key. Make sure you use 2 specific relevant evidence pieces from the course countries. So we're going to move into those body paragraphs. Let's take a glance at them. Mine are very lengthy right now. I just wanted to show you the depth that you could add into it. I often see essays that maybe they didn't utilize all the time and could have added more things. So what I did is I wrote this up, then I went back and added more details. So here, my first point on democratic regimes was that power derives directly from the citizens. And don't forget, you have to use the course concept here. So I have to use legitimacy. And you may have a choice, or you may have a very specific thing you have to use on your test this year. So I have to use legitimacy, and this is the perfect spot to do so. I'm talking about democracy. Power comes from the people. My example is Mexico. Mexico people, elect their representatives. They elect their president, and this gives them a say in government. Having a say in government helps build up the right to rule of that government. That regime, that government, has the will of the people. They have kind of popular sovereignty. The power derives directly from the people, and that creates legitimacy. You feel like your government is legit because you had a say in its existence. So you believe it has the right to rule. And I included that in here because I know I have to talk about legitimacy. Now, what's important is that's my evidence. My evidence is all here in this first part of the paragraph. I'm explaining that, the power comes from the people in democracy. I gave an example of Mexico and how the power comes from the people. And then I said, power coming from the people leads to an increase in legitimacy. Now, you need to explain how this connects to sovereignty now. So what I've done is I've made basically a reasoning area, and I've italicized it. So I took a couple sentences here. You can answer this really in one sentence if you want. You're basically saying this supports my claim because. So don't be afraid to say because. I'm basically saying this strong democratic legitimacy helps maintain sovereignty because. So I'm using because in my reasoning, and I'm explaining that legitimacy helps to maintain control over a country, helps to maintain control over a state. You want to connect it back to your claim that democratic regimes are better at maintaining sovereignty. And if you don't do this paragraph, you're losing out on points. You need to explain how this connects back to your claim. So make sure you can't trust that the reader is going to understand that how it connects back to your claim. So don't be afraid to use the end of your paragraph to connect it back literally to your claim. You could even say in there, this supports my claim that democracy helps maintain sovereignty because, and then explain it. Remember, I want you to lock in the points. And it's all about structuring things properly and showing that you can explain something properly. So lock in those points. So what I've done so far is I have evidence. I've utilized Mexico. I've talked about legitimacy, and I have given reasoning about how it connects. So I have used one or more of the following 4 countries. I have used legitimacy to support my case. I've responded to the claim. I've created a defensible claim, and I have I have one piece of evidence from one of the countries. So I move into my last paragraph. And some of you might be stretched for time to get this last paragraph in, so it might be a little shorter, and that certainly could happen. Essentially, I'm presenting another thing that's going to help out my argument. And in this case, I wanted to argue that democracies tend to have more peaceful responses from frustrated people, from protests and whatnot, and they tend to have more peaceful developments from that. So Mexico, for example, they've certainly had protests, and they've had attempted revolutions from like the Zapatistas, but a lot of times those protests resulted in more peaceful transitions, negotiations, increases in rights. They didn't result in extreme violence. And a lot of authoritarian regimes, I use examples of like the Soviet Union and Iran under the Shah and Porfirio Diaz in Mexico. They were authoritarian and they faced violent ends. The people got frustrated with the lack of rights and took more violent actions against the regime. So I'm making an argument that these democratic regimes tend to last longer than the extreme authoritarian regimes that don't give rights and liberties that other countries have. And of course, I use also China's violence against protests as an example of how they weaken their legitimacy. And I think if I were going to rewrite this, I would focus a lot more on China here. Don't forget that it says, choose one or more of the following 4 countries. I've already used Mexico, so check that off. I can certainly talk about China, even though it's not in that list. If I were going to rewrite this, I would talk about China and how they've received a lot of international criticism, and they've received sanctions and penalties from other countries, and that itself interferes with sovereignty. It's taken away some of their control over their own state. There's a lot of political pressure from other countries to not be so oppressive on their people. So I think that would be an interesting way to focus on this point. Now, if I were going to do the authoritarian area, I would talk about how, well, our country choices here are Iran and Russia. I would talk about how Iran's able to control things. An authoritarian regime is able to give different groups something in exchange for their cooperation because they have so much more control. So think the Iranian people and how the Iranian government and how they're able to give seats to minority groups and how they're involving the Azeri people more in the government. They're trying to get more power over their territory by using their power wisely. And of course, you could also talk about opposition not being very visible. Think of like China and Iran and the Great Firewall. You don't necessarily know that the opposition is there. And if you're a person in China or Iran, you may have no way to figure out that there is any opposition. So that creates more control for China. So maybe the authoritarian pathway is a better pathway for you to take on. I'd be interested to see what kind of arguments you could make about this topic. But I hope you understand a little bit more about the structure. You got to make sure you have a good, clear, defensible claim. You got to make sure you have 2 areas that you're going to focus on, 2 points you're making about that claim. And you got to use some information from your countries to back it up, and make sure you connect those evidence with your reasoning. Okay. Thank you for listening. Have a great rest of your day.